Paul was only 14, but his life was already burdened with more weight than many adults could handle. From a young age, he shared a deep bond with his maternal grandfather, Pedro, who was more than just family to him. Pedro was his mentor, his friend, and the substitute for the mother he lost at a tender age. Paul's mother passed away when he was 6, and since then, his relationship with his father, Francisco, became distant and fragmented. Francisco, a man of few words, seemed unsure how to connect with his son after his wife's death. His long hours as a truck driver often kept him away, leaving Paul in the care of his grandfather Pedro, a respected mechanic in their small town. Pedro's workshop, situated in the backyard, was a sanctuary for Paul. The scent of oil, the sound of tools, and the gleam of metallic parts fascinated him from his earliest memories. He spent countless hours there, watching Pedro work, learning the secrets of engines, and dreaming of becoming a skilled mechanic like his grandfather. One afternoon after school, Paul eagerly ran to the workshop, knowing Pedro would be there. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the workshop. "Hi, Grandpa," Paul greeted with a smile as he entered. Pedro looked up from under the hood of an old car and returned the smile. "Hello, my boy. How was school today?" he asked, wiping his grease-stained hands on a cloth. "It was good. We had a math test, and I think I did well," Paul replied, approaching Pedro. "And you? You've been working on this car since yesterday, haven't you?" "Yes, it's an old one. Needs a lot of care, but nothing we can't handle together, right?" Pedro winked at Paul, who felt proud to be included. Paul grabbed a screwdriver and began helping, feeling at home in that familiar, safe environment. As they worked, they talked about life, cars, and dreams. "One day, I want to be as good a mechanic as you," Paul said, his eyes gleaming with determination. Pedro paused, looking at his grandson with a mix of pride and tenderness. "I have no doubt about that, Paul. You have talent and passion, and that's the most important thing. Plus, you have your heart in the right place. Your mother would be very proud of you." The mention of Paul's mother brought a moment of silence. It was a delicate subject, but Pedro always managed to comfort Paul. "I miss her, Grandpa," Paul murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I know, my dear. I miss her too," Pedro replied, pulling Paul into a tight hug. "But remember, she is always with you, in every choice you make and every achievement of yours." After a long hug, they returned to work, filling the workshop with the familiar sounds of tools and laughter. Pedro's presence was a cornerstone in Paul's life, a constant amid the uncertainties of adolescence. Francisco, however, remained a distant figure. Their conversations were brief and superficial. Francisco seemed to carry an invisible weight, a pain he never shared with his son. One night, as Paul prepared for bed, he wished he could share his passions and dreams with his father as he did with his grandfather. But such moments were rare, and Paul found solace in Pedro's love and support. Days passed, and Paul continued to learn and grow under his grandfather's guidance. Each piece he disassembled and reassembled, each engine he repaired, brought him closer to his dream. Despite the difficulties and his father's absence, Paul knew he had Pedro's unwavering support. One sunny afternoon, Paul returned from school, eager to share the day's news with his grandfather. He entered the house with a smile, but something felt off. The workshop was unusually silent. Paul felt a chill down his spine. "Grandpa," he called, walking toward the workshop. Inside, he found Pedro lying on the floor next to a partially disassembled car. Panic surged through him. "Grandpa, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Pedro slowly opened his eyes, managing a weak smile. "Paul, my boy," he murmured with difficulty. "I'll call for help." "Stay here," Paul said, running to the front door and shouting for help. Neighbors quickly responded to his cries. Mrs. Maria, the closest neighbor, was the first to arrive. "What happened, Paul?" she asked, dialing emergency services as soon as she saw Pedro. "My grandfather, he's not well," Paul replied, panic evident in his voice. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived. The paramedics stabilized Pedro and placed him on a stretcher. Paul held his grandfather's hand, trying to hold back tears. "Grandpa, You're going to be okay. I'm here with you, he said as the paramedics took Pedro to the ambulance. Pedro squeezed his grandson's hand. His eyes filled with love. I love you, Paul. I've always been proud of you. Never forget that, Pedro said weakly. I love you too, Grandpa. Please don't leave me, Paul replied, tears streaming down his face. At the hospital, Pedro was rushed to the emergency room while Paul waited in the corridor, his hands trembling and face wet with tears. Time dragged painfully until a doctor approached with a grave expression. Paul, he called, looking at the boy with sympathy. Your grandfather suffered a heart attack. We did everything we could, but he didn't make it. I'm sorry. Paul's world shattered. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the loss. Sitting alone in the hospital, he couldn't stop thinking about life without his grandfather. Pedro had been his guide, his mentor, the person he loved most in the world. The sadness was crushing. Francisco arrived at the hospital, looking uncomfortable and unsure how to console his son. Paul, he called hesitantly. Paul looked up, his eyes red from crying. Francisco sat next to him, struggling to find words. I'm sorry about your grandfather. I know he was very important to you, Francisco said, placing a hand on Paul's shoulder. Paul nodded, unable to speak. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Francisco wanted to comfort his son, but the emotional distance between them made it difficult. I'm here for you, Paul. I know I haven't been very present, but I'm here now, Francisco said, his voice trembling. Paul looked at his father, seeing vulnerability for the first time. Maybe, he thought, this could be the start of something new between them. Despite the pain and loss, there was a small hope they could grow closer. They sat together in silence, sharing the weight of loss and hope for a new beginning. The day of Pedro's funeral was cloudy and somber. The gray sky mirrored the pain Paul felt. He stood beside his grandfather's coffin, tears silently streaming down his face. Francisco was at his side, visibly uncomfortable, trying to find a way to comfort his son. It will be all right, Paul, Francisco said, placing a hand on Paul's shoulder. Your grandfather is in a better place now. Paul nodded, but remained silent. His father's words couldn't fill the void left by Pedro's absence. He felt lost, as if his guiding compass had vanished. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. The tools in the workshop were silent, and Pedro's absence was felt in every corner. Francisco decided it was best for Paul to move into his house, where he could receive the care and support of a family. Francisco had recently married Elizabeth, a kind and caring woman. Elizabeth had a son from a previous marriage, Ronaldo. When Paul arrived at his new home, he was warmly welcomed by Elizabeth and Ronaldo. Paul, this is Elizabeth, my wife, and this is Ronaldo, Francisco introduced them. It's a pleasure to meet you, Paul, Elizabeth said with a smile. Feel at home. This house is yours too. Hi, Paul, Ronaldo greeted with a friendly smile. I heard you like cars. I'm a fan too. We can talk about them later if you want. Paul nodded shyly, still shaken by his grandfather's loss. However, the warm reception made him feel a bit more at ease. He was shown to his new room, which was cozy and well-decorated. In the following days, Paul began to adapt to the new routine. Elizabeth treated him like her own son, always checking if he was okay, if he was hungry, or if he needed help with his homework. Paul, have you done your homework? She would ask gently while preparing dinner. Yes, I've done it. Thank you, Paul would respond, feeling welcomed by her care. Ronaldo also became a great friend to Paul. They shared common interests, especially the love for cars. They often spent afternoons talking about engines, models, and dreams of becoming mechanics. Did you know my grandfather had a workshop? Paul told Ronaldo during one of their conversations. I used to spend a lot of time there, learning from him. That's amazing, Ronaldo replied, eyes shining with enthusiasm. We can try to build a model together someday. Sure, I'd love that, Paul said, smiling for the first time in days. Despite still deeply missing his grandfather, Paul began to find a new balance in his life. The way Francisco, Elizabeth, and Ronaldo treated him made him feel more comfortable and less alone. Francisco, even with his difficulty in expressing emotions, was trying to connect with his son. One night, Francisco entered Paul's room while he was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "Paul, I just want you to know that I'm here for you. I know I haven't been good at showing it, but I'm trying," Francisco said softly. Paul looked at his father, seeing the earnestness in his eyes. "I know, Dad. Thanks for being here," Paul replied, feeling a bit closer to his father. The pain of losing Pedro was still there, but the love and care of his new family were helping Paul move forward. He knew he would never forget his grandfather, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Over time, he began to believe that even without Pedro by his side, he could achieve his dreams and find happiness again. Francisco watched his son closely. Despite Paul adapting well to the new house and family, Francisco noticed the sadness in the boy's eyes. Determined to cheer his son up, Francisco had an idea. The next day, Francisco went to Pedro's old workshop. He found an old car Pedro had been working on, unfinished but significant to Paul. With friends' help, he transported the car to his house. When Paul came home from school that afternoon, he found the old car parked in the yard. His eyes widened with surprise and happiness. "Dad, is this Grandpa's car?" Paul exclaimed, running to the vehicle. "How did you get it here?" Francisco smiled at his son's reaction. "I thought it would be a nice surprise. We can finish assembling it together. What do you think?" Francisco said, placing a hand on Paul's shoulder. For the first time since his grandfather's death, Paul felt genuine joy. He hugged his father, thanking him for the surprise. "This means so much to me, Dad." "Thank you," Paul said, eyes brimming with tears. "You're welcome, son. We're in this together," Francisco replied, returning the hug. Ronaldo, who had been watching from a distance, felt a pang of jealousy. Although Francisco wasn't his biological father, he wished to receive the same attention and affection. Elizabeth, seeing the old car in the yard, made a strange expression but knew it was important to Paul. "It's a good gesture, Francisco. If it makes Paul happy, that's what matters," Elizabeth said, though her expression showed some concern about the car's presence. "I'll have to travel for a few weeks," Francisco told Paul later that night. "But I promise I'll be back soon. I want you to start planning what we'll do with the car, okay?" Paul felt a tightness in his chest at hearing about his father's trip. He was getting used to Francisco's presence and didn't want him to leave for so long. "I'll miss you, Dad," Paul said, his voice choked with emotion. Francisco hugged him tightly. "I'll miss you too, son, but you're in good hands. Elizabeth will take good care of you," Francisco replied, trying to comfort him. Elizabeth appeared at the door with a warm smile. "Don't worry, Francisco. I'll take good care of Paul. He'll be safe and well here," she said, looking at Paul with tenderness. Francisco then said goodbye to everyone, got into his truck, and drove away, leaving Paul and Elizabeth alone in the house. "Let's go inside, Paul. You've had a long day," Elizabeth said, guiding him back inside. Paul went to his room, feeling the weight of loneliness again. But seeing the car in the yard gave him a sense of hope and connection with his grandfather. He knew that with Elizabeth's support and his father's promise to return and work on the car together, things could get better. Paul lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and gradually his worries began to dissipate. He fell asleep with the image of his grandfather and the car in his mind, feeling that somehow Pedro was still with him. The next day, Paul was woken early by Elizabeth. She entered his room with a serious expression and a list of chores in her hands. "Paul, I need you to help clean the house today," she said, not leaving much room for discussion. Paul, still groggy, got up and began to work. As he scrubbed the floors and cleaned the furniture, he watched Ronaldo playing video games in the living room. He wondered why his stepbrother wasn't helping but decided not to say anything, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. Elizabeth helped a bit with the cleaning but soon went to the phone and started chatting with a friend. Paul was left to finish the tasks almost entirely on his own. He cleaned every room, feeling the exhaustion grow, but obeyed his stepmother without complaint. The following days followed the same pattern. Elizabeth started asking Paul to do more and more chores, even after school. He did the laundry, went shopping, and helped with cooking. Ronaldo, on the other hand, continued with his activities without being disturbed. Paul felt exhausted but didn't want to cause problems. Ronaldo noticed that Paul was always busy and began to distance himself. There was no more time for conversations about cars or playing together. Paul missed these interactions but couldn't find a way to balance the chores and leisure. One afternoon, while washing the dishes, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth went to answer it, and shortly after returned with a man by her side. "Paul, this is Andre, my brother," Elizabeth said, introducing the man. "Nice to meet you, Paul," Andre said, extending his hand. Paul shook hands, feeling a bit uncomfortable with his presence. While Paul continued washing the dishes, Andre and Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, chatting animatedly. Paul noticed that in the following days, Elizabeth became even more strict with him. Her words were increasingly harsh while she treated Ronaldo with kindness and attention. When Francisco finally returned home, Paul was overjoyed to see his father, who brought gifts for everyone. Francisco, noticing Paul's joy, smiled and hugged him. "I have a surprise for you, Paul," Francisco said, handing him a box. Inside was a brand new set of tools for you to use on Grandpa's car. "Thank you, Dad," Paul said, moved by the gift. With Francisco's return, Elizabeth's behavior changed drastically. She went back to treating Paul well, offering him attention and care as she had before Francisco's departure. Paul noticed the difference but said nothing, just enjoying the time with his father and the new harmony at home. Life seemed to return to normal, and Paul felt more relieved and happy. Although the previous weeks had been difficult, now he had his father's presence and could continue his dream of working on his grandfather's car. Francisco and Paul started assembling the car piece by piece. It was an arduous but rewarding project that brought them even closer. They spent entire afternoons in the garage, swapping parts, tightening screws, and discussing the best way to restore the vehicle. Everything seemed to be getting back to normal, and life followed a calm and productive rhythm. One day, while they were engrossed in work, Andre appeared for a visit. He greeted Francisco with a friendly smile. "Hi, Francisco. How are things?" Andre asked, shaking his hand. "We're doing well, working on Pedro's car," Francisco replied, pointing to the vehicle. "It seems like a good project. Maybe I can help someday," Andre said, observing the car with interest. "That would be great. It's always good to have more hands to help," Francisco replied, accepting the offer with gratitude. After a brief conversation, Andre went to talk to his sister Elizabeth before saying goodbye and leaving. Francisco then noticed that Paul seemed more tired and thinner than usual. Concerned, he called his son for a conversation. "Paul, are you okay? Is there something you want to tell me?" Francisco asked, observing his son's face closely. Paul hesitated for a moment, but decided not to worry his father. "I'm fine, Dad. I'm just studying a lot for exams," he replied, forcing a smile. Francisco nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. A few days later, Francisco had to travel again. The news made Paul anxious, fearing what might happen in his father's absence. "I'll miss you, Dad," Paul said, hugging Francisco tightly. "I'll miss you too, son, but I'll be back soon. Take care, and if you need anything, call me," Francisco replied, trying to reassure his son. As soon as Francisco left, Elizabeth's demeanor changed drastically. She returned to treating Paul with coldness and authoritarianism, making him do all the chores in the house alone. "Paul, clean the whole house today. I want everything spotless," she ordered, leaving no room for contestation. Paul obeyed silently, starting to clean while Elizabeth and Ronaldo prepared to go out. "We're going to the pizzeria. Have fun cleaning," Ronaldo mocked, laughing as he got into the car. Paul watched the car drive away, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. He started cleaning the living room, scrubbing the floor, and dusting the furniture, but his thoughts were far away. He felt unjustly treated, but knew complaining would only make things worse. Elizabeth treated Ronaldo like a prince, while Paul was treated like a servant. As he cleaned, Paul remembered the conversations he had with his grandfather Pedro. His grandfather always encouraged him to be strong and never give up, even in the most difficult situations. These thoughts helped him keep going despite the adversities. After cleaning the living room, Paul moved to the kitchen and started washing the dishes. The work seemed endless, but he kept at it. Finally, after hours of cleaning, he finished all the chores and went to bed, exhausted. It was past midnight when Elizabeth and Ronaldo returned home, accompanied by Andre. Paul heard the car arriving and decided to lock himself in his room to avoid confrontations. However, the sound of laughter and conversations from the living room made him curious. In the middle of the night, Paul woke up thirsty and decided to go to the kitchen to get some water. As he walked down the stairs, he heard voices in the living room. Curious, he peeked and saw Andre and Elizabeth talking in low voices. "Do you think Francisco doesn't suspect anything?" Andre asked with a malicious smile. "He has no idea. Francisco is a fool," Elizabeth replied, laughing while taking a sip of wine. "He fell for our lie, thinking we're siblings when we're actually just friends," Andre said with a triumphant expression. Paul felt his heart race as he heard this. They had lied to Francisco the whole time. Elizabeth continued, "He's so naive. If he knew the truth, he'd be devastated. But he doesn't suspect a thing." She laughed again. "What do we do now?" Andre asked, sitting closer to Elizabeth. "We continue with the plan, of course. Everything is going as planned." "Francisco trusts me blindly," she said, taking another sip of wine. "We just need to keep Paul under control. He's the only one who could ruin our plans." "That boy, he seems smart," Andre commented, frowning. "But if he tries anything, we know how to handle him," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with malice. Paul felt a chill down his spine. He never imagined Elizabeth could be plotting something so sinister. He needed to tell his father as soon as possible, but how? Francisco wouldn't be back for another week. Until then, he would have to endure the situation. As Andre and Elizabeth continued their conversation, Paul quietly returned to his room, trying to process everything he had just discovered. His mind was racing with questions and concerns. He felt betrayed and vulnerable, but knew he needed to be strong. The next morning, Paul woke up early and began his chores as usual. Elizabeth barely looked at him, busy with her own tasks. Ronaldo was in the living room, playing video games, oblivious to everything. During the week, Elizabeth became even more strict with Paul, demanding he do more chores and treating him with harsh words. Paul felt increasingly tired and overwhelmed but stayed strong, waiting for his father's return. When Francisco finally came back, Paul ran to hug him, feeling immense relief. Francisco brought gifts for everyone, and Paul felt a momentary joy upon receiving a new set of tools to continue working on his grandfather's car. Paul felt he couldn't wait any longer. He knew he needed to tell his father the whole truth, even if it was hard to believe. So, one night, he called Francisco for a serious conversation. "Dad, I need to talk to you. It's about Elizabeth and Andre," Paul began, his voice trembling. Francisco frowned, worried. "What happened, Paul?" he asked, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "They're not who they say they are. I overheard a conversation one night and found out they're not siblings. They're just friends, and they're deceiving you. Elizabeth is using you, Dad, and they talked about getting rid of me because I'm getting too suspicious," Paul said, his eyes filling with tears. Francisco was silent, trying to process what he had just heard. It was hard to believe that Elizabeth, the woman he had been married to for a year, could be lying to him. "Paul, this is very serious. I don't know what to think, but I promise I'll check if this is true," Francisco said, trying to comfort his son. Francisco spent the next few days deep in thought, trying to figure out how to resolve the situation. He knew confronting Elizabeth directly wouldn't work because she would deny everything. So, he decided to take a more discreet approach. One day, he waited until everyone was out of the house and installed hidden cameras in various rooms. The cameras captured both video and audio. For a few days, nothing happened. But then one night, Francisco reviewed the recordings and heard a conversation that made him fear for Paul's life. "Paul is getting more suspicious. He's talking to Francisco. We need to deal with this boy somehow, or he'll ruin our plans," Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with malice. "Yes, we need to act fast. He could be a serious problem for us," Andre replied. Francisco felt a chill down his spine. There was no doubt anymore. He needed to get Paul out of the house immediately. Without wasting time, Francisco woke Paul up and explained the situation. "Son, we need to get out of here now. It's dangerous to stay here," Francisco said urgently. They quickly packed some clothes and went to a hotel, where they stayed hidden for a few days. Elizabeth soon realized something was wrong because Francisco would never do this without a reason. She began to suspect he had already discovered the plan. While Francisco was determined to gather evidence against Elizabeth, he was surprised to find out she already had a criminal record. Elizabeth and Andre worked together, scamming wealthy men. Andre would find them, and Elizabeth would seduce them to take their money. Francisco couldn't believe he had spent a year married to such a woman. Francisco gathered all the evidence he could and contacted the authorities. He knew it was the only way to ensure Paul's safety and get justice. The shock of discovering Elizabeth was a criminal left him devastated, but he knew he needed to be strong for his son. While waiting for the authorities to act, Francisco and Paul continued staying at the hotel, trying to find some normalcy amid the chaos. Francisco reflected on how he had been deceived and how it almost cost his son's safety. "I'm so sorry, Paul. I'm sorry I didn't believe you before," Francisco said, tears in his eyes, hugging his son. "It's okay, Dad. The important thing is that we're together now and safe," Paul replied, hugging him back tightly. Despite everything, they knew they had each other and that together they could overcome any adversity. A few days later, the police arrested Andre and Elizabeth, putting an end to the scheme that had disrupted Paul and Francisco's lives. Ronaldo, Elizabeth's son, was sent to live with a distant aunt who could take proper care of him. Finally, Paul and Francisco found the peace they had longed for. With the house quiet and free from the tension that had hovered over them, father and son could enjoy moments of calm and reflection. One afternoon, while resting in the living room, Paul couldn't help but express a doubt that had been bothering him. "Dad, there's something that doesn't make sense to me," Paul began, looking at Francisco. "Elizabeth and Andre were conning wealthy men, but you're not rich. You're a truck driver and don't earn much. Why would they try to con you?" Francisco sighed deeply, visibly thoughtful. After a few moments of silence, he decided to reveal a secret he had kept for a long time. "Paul, there's something I've never told you. When your mother passed away, she had a large sum of money in the bank," Francisco said, his expression serious. "She was always very hardworking and saved money. When she received the terminal cancer diagnosis, she made a will, transferring all her money to me. She said the money was to be used when you were older, for your studies." Paul was surprised by the revelation, his eyes wide. "And you've kept that money all this time?" he asked, still trying to process the information. "Yes, I've kept it. It was your mother's wish that it be used for you, for your future," Francisco replied with a sad smile. "Andre and Elizabeth found out about the money and targeted me." Paul nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. For the first time, it all made sense. "I can't believe it. I never would have imagined," Paul said, still in shock. "Neither did I, son. But now that we know the truth, we can move forward," Francisco said firmly. After a moment of silence, Francisco smiled and looked at Paul with a sparkle in his eyes. "Actually, I have a surprise for you," he said, standing up. "Come with me." Curious, Paul followed his father to the garage. Francisco opened the door, and to Paul's surprise, there was Pedro's car, fully assembled. Every piece was in place, shining under the garage light. The car looked perfect, as if it had come straight from Pedro's skillful hands. "Dad, this is incredible. You finished assembling the car?" Paul exclaimed, his eyes shining with emotion. "Yes, Paul. I thought it was the right time to finish what we started. Your grandfather would be proud," Francisco said, smiling. Paul ran to the car, touching each piece with reverence. He felt a deep connection with his grandfather and immense relief seeing the project finally completed. "Thank you, Dad. This means a lot to me," Paul said, hugging Francisco tightly. "You're welcome, son. We're in this together, always," Francisco replied, returning the hug affectionately. With the car assembled and the truth revealed, Paul and Francisco could finally move forward, stronger and more united than ever. They knew that together, they could face any challenge life threw at them. And with Pedro's memory and Paul's mother's protection, they felt ready for a bright and promising future.